Regarding 9/11, there was plenty of intelligence to suggest that Al-Qaeda wanted to attack the United States. That intelligence was not shared between the FBI and the CIA.
If someone stepped back and looked at the world right now, Ukraine, the Middle East, tensions with China, nuclear risk, would you say we are entering a more dangerous era of global politics, or have things always been this unstable and we're just beginning to notice a bit more now?
It's been a 4-year war with horrific casualties, over 1 million casualties. Last week, 35,000 soldiers lost their lives on both sides. Just, total loss. And the numbers look like World War I at Verdun in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. And
So, for most of us, geopolitics is something we experience through headlines. There's wars, alliances, tensions between nations, and decisions made by leaders thousands of kilometers away. But behind those headlines is an incredible complex world of diplomacy, intelligence, power struggles, and sometimes mistakes that shape the world we live in. My guest today has spent decades studying and working inside that world. Ronald Bee is a national security expert and a scholar of international relations. He's worked in institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the US Naval Academy, and the Congressional Research Service. His work spans the Cold War, nuclear policy, global conflict, and diplomacy. Wow, that's impressive. Ronald, welcome to Voices Unfiltered.
well, thank you for having me. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you very much. Ronald, if someone stepped back and looked at the world right now, Ukraine, the Middle East, tensions with China, nuclear risk, would you say we are entering a more dangerous era of global politics, or have things always been this unstable and we're just beginning to notice a bit more now?
It's always been a bit unstable in the world, but when the world acquired nuclear weapons during World War II, that made it much more dangerous. And that certainly made it dangerous for the Cold War. And it's coming back in terms of why we're seeing conflict and why we're trying to avoid it in a variety of places in the world. But now it's breaking out because the stakes are very high, and they've always been high, but we go through these periods of peace and tension, and now one could say conflict because of what you see happening in Ukraine. It's been a 4-year war with horrific casualties, over 1 million casualties. Last week, 35,000 soldiers lost their lives on both sides. Just, total loss. And the numbers look like World War I at Verdun in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. And that's been a bloody, terrible war. Now, just 4 years ago started. We now have a war in the Middle East with the Islamic Republic that started 4 days ago. And I've been very busy as a result of that on local TV, radio, and other podcasts. But the issue there also centered around nuclear weapons, didn't it? Because our president said that the main reason we had to go in is because Iran will not give up its aspirations for a nuclear weapon. And in fact, we evidently offered them free 3% enriched uranium in perpetuity if they give up their uranium enrichment, and they turned it flat down. They said, no, we don't want that. And at that point, it was clear that the Iranians were slow walking the negotiations to build up their defenses in preparation for an attack. And so the attack happened on, I guess it was the morning of February 28th, February 27th here, but February 28th there, and has been going on quite intensively for the last 3 to 4 days. But this is conflict and has the opportunity to change the geopolitical outcomes of the Middle East, as well as improve the situation depending on what happens. And I think Israel and the United States have the situation under control, and it's just going to be a matter of time when the conflict will end after they destroy the infrastructure of oppression that is on the ground there, as well as the main things they're worried about, which are the ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons program. So we live in dangerous times, but we also live in times where there's hope attached to this particular conflict. The one in Ukraine, I think, has been a war of attrition. Russia just expects to win over time. And as a result, that's why you see this horrendous amount of money spent, as well as the horrendous casualties. You're looking at it from an interesting place in South Africa because you're far away from the conflicts itself, but you have many conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa that I know you're aware of, but most people aren't aware of, that flare up from time to time, and economic problems flare up all the time. You're not immune to it, of course.
No, of course. And I want to get into the wars, but first, I mean, you've studied geopolitical and conflict for decades now. What is the one thing the public fundamentally misunderstands about how the world actually works behind the scenes?
National interests. The public needs to understand that each nation has its own national interests, and those are measured in economic, political, and military terms. If there is to be a conflict, there has to be rationales in all three of those categories why it's necessary to go to war or to confront somebody diplomatically or to confront or build up weaponry in a place that keeps them occupied. And so what I teach my students is that if you were to look at the news through the economic, political, and military lens, for example, let's take a look at Iran economically. What do they have that's of economic interest to the world? Oil. They have the third largest reserves, and they have been selling it under the table to China against the wishes of the international community, at least the European community in the United States, that has placed sanctions on that oil because they don't want it to go to China. And that, in turn, funds the budget of the Iranian government, which supports proxies overseas known as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, as well as buys equipment from China, ballistic missile technology, drone technology, which they have also been giving to Russia to use in Ukraine. So this is all connected in a very important way. So I always, politically, there are very few democratic rights, if any, in the Islamic Republic of Iran. In fact, protests over the last 20 years by its people suggested that they're on the poor end of the spectrum in terms of human rights treatment. Let's just say that since January, the latest figures suggest that over 50,000 civilians have been killed in the streets. That's since January. We're just, in March. So that's over a 2-month period. They've killed 50,000 of their own people in the streets. How long would that go on anywhere without there being some sort of trouble? And there certainly is a lot of trouble now, and this is a huge military operation that has come in to answer this question. So politically, they're not democratic. They threaten the allies that are democratic of the United States, including Israel, which is a non-NATO ally, as are many of the Arab states in the region, too, of the United States. But the real problem that has prevented peace in the Middle East, in my opinion, and I've worked there for 6 years with 22 different militaries. The one problem that has prevented peace in the Middle East has been the Islamic Revolution and their attempts to export it and use the Arab territories around Israel as trampolines to destroy Israel. If every one of their proxies has a charter, and in every single charter it says we want the destruction of Israel. If you're Israel, how do you deal with them? How do you negotiate with people that have that in their charter? It's very difficult for them to do so. And then after October 7th, when Hamas, with the assistance of Iran, with the training of Iran, with the weapons of Iran, invaded Israel and killed 2,000 to 3,000 innocent civilians, brutally took hostages. So politically, let's look at this even more so. Politically, you have institutions like the UN and the UN Human Rights Commission and you have the International Court, The Hague, these are political institutions that are trying to do the right thing. But every single one of the actions of Hamas has been a war crime. Since 2005, they have shot missiles into Israel at civilian targets. That's a war crime. You're not supposed to shoot anything at any civilians. All right. Military, that's another distinction, but not at civilians. So every single rocket that has been shot at a civilian target, including the Iranian missiles that have landed on hotels and airports and apartment buildings, that's a war crime. Let's see, maybe we can make parallels here. So when you take a hostage, that is a war crime. In 1979, 53 Americans from the American embassy were taken hostage for 444 days. And they were finally released after negotiations with the Reagan administration. I was a very young man at the time, just finished graduate school, and I ended up working for a think tank where we had a contract with the Pentagon. So I was working on the nuclear issue at the time, nuclear weapons. But the political issues are very important. So if you have economic rationale, political rationale, and then what about the military rationale? Military rationale for the United States is that we have 40,000 troops in the region at over 20 to 30 different bases. The military rationale, there's one that what have we paid in terms of costs of the military? Well, over 1,000 soldiers were injured in Iraq from IEDs manufactured in Iran and placed in Iraq by Soleimani and the IRGC. That statement has been made by General Petraeus, who commanded the forces there, who was the head of CENTCOM and also head of the CIA at a certain point. And so there's that military cost. Plus, the proxies of Iran blew up the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, which killed 242 Marines, U.S. Marines. So there's that blood on the hands. There are the proxies that took hostages after October 7th. Hamas took a couple of hundred hostages, including 20 or so Americans that happened to be in Israel, unfortunately, at the time for them. So you have economics, oil, you have politics, undemocratic and terrorist ideology, and then you have the military stakes, the military that's threatened by the Islamic Republic, and if that ain't enough, ever since they've been in power, every day or every time there is a rally, what are the chants that we hear? Death to America and death to Israel. That starts the public rally. So at a certain point, this becomes something that you can't ignore, especially if they're on the verge of building a nuclear weapon. And I would compare it to Hitler's Germany. The original arms race was not between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was between the United States, the United Kingdom versus Nazi Germany, because the Germans discovered uranium fission in 1938. German scientists did. And it became clear that they had a nuclear weapons project to intelligence sources. And that led to the Manhattan Project in the United States to get to a nuclear bomb before the Nazis did, which they did. But I see this as a comparable for the Israelis in the same situation, because the Iranians, if they were to use a bomb on Israel, which is the size of our state of New Jersey, pretty small, one could take out Tel Aviv, another could take out Israel. And in the negotiations with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner over the last month, the Iranians said that, we have enough enriched uranium to build 12 nuclear bombs. And that's how you negotiate an end to your nuclear program, by telling you how much uranium you have that could be made into a nuclear weapon. So you could see, if you're Israel, you're not going to wait around and do nothing about it. You mentioned that I had worked for the IAEA. My first day on the job was the day that Israel attacked the Ozark reactor outside of Baghdad, Iraq, on June 6, 1981. And it was the busiest day in the history of the IAEA, because Iraq was a member of the IAEA. Israel was not. So I spent the next 3 months briefing the Secretary General, a man by the name of Hans Blix, about what was being said in the newspapers about the raid, because I speak French, German, Italian, and some English. And so I could at least brief him on what the press was saying. So that was a interesting time. And that started something for Israel called the Begin Doctrine, because it was Menachem Begin who was in power during that time, who basically said that if any country is building a nuclear weapon that could be used against Israel, we have a right to take it out. We have a right to attack it. And what I would call this is preemptive non-proliferation. And so they did that on June 6, 1981 with Iraq, before the reactor went online, to avoid the radiation spillage. They did it in September of 2007 against Syria, that had a reactor that also had North Korean nuclear scientists in it, and they are doing it now in Iran, because the Iranians were intent on having a nuclear weapon.
The US Israel strike on Iran. Was this an
Mhm.
act of deterrence, or are we witnessing an escalation of a shadow war that has been unfolding for some time? And I guess basically what I'm asking you is, how close are we to a World War III?
Well, this is always a question I get whenever I go on and there's a conflict, and I don't think we're very close to it at all, because frankly, I think, have you noticed what's happened over the last 4 days? There hasn't been much of a retaliation. Iranian Navy is at the bottom of the sea. They have no air force. Their air defenses were stripped, and both Chinese and Russian been made into chopped suey and borscht. The leadership is gone. 49 leaders have been killed, and there's a systematic destruction of the infrastructure of repression that has been killing 50,000 people who died in the streets over the last 2 months. And so it's not, I don't think that's going to develop into a world war, simply because the Iranians have no way to sustain it. They have attacked people who were neutral along the Gulf. They've attacked 10 different countries, including Saudi Arabia, including Kuwait, including Oman, including Qatar, including Bahrain, including Iraq, including Cyprus, including Israel. And what they've done is just shot their missiles willy-nilly in the general direction that had been pre-programmed to go. And where they're all landing? In civilian areas. Civilian areas.
Who is Iran's alliances at this point?
Well, they were allied, and were, because they're not helping them much. I would guess they're a little upset with them right now, with China, Russia, Venezuela, but that's no longer. China, Russia were their biggest allies, because number one, Russia provided the nuclear assistance to them, as well as China. Both are nuclear nations. China bought under the table oil from Iran in exchange for technology that it used in its ballistic missile and drones. So both the Russians and the Chinese have stayed out of this, because they probably realize it's not in their vital interest to get involved with a nuclear superpower. And so the Russians are otherwise occupied in Ukraine. The Chinese are more interested in Taiwan, but they're probably taking notice of this very, very clearly. Why? Because the United States, under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, has an obligation to come and defend Taiwan if attacked by communist China. And that's been in place since 1979. And few people realize that, we had a NATO-like alliance in the early 1950s with Taiwan. President Eisenhower placed nuclear weapons on Taiwan to deter the Chinese from attacking it. So there is a long history of the United States defending it. But then what do you do in 1979 when Jimmy Carter says, well, the real China is the People's Republic of China? Congress came out with the Taiwan Relations Act to keep us focused on not just the economic potential of a communist China, but our defense of a democratic Taiwan that otherwise would be left out in the lurch. So lots of things going on here, aren't there?
There's a lot of things. And, if this conflict between Russia and Ukraine drags on for years, who actually benefits strategically from this?
Well, I think the West does, because you're draining Russia's ability to fight by spending all its resources and its manpower in Ukraine. And in fact, if you walk through the streets I haven't, but I've seen video of it, the streets of Moscow, you'll note that there aren't any men walking around because they've all gone to Ukraine and many have died there. And many young men have left Russia to try and get out of the draft so that they won't have to go, and many have gone to Turkey. In fact, I have a couple of students, Russian students, that fled to Turkey through Chechnya, where they have direct flights that go to Istanbul. So you have people realizing that this is a drain on the Russian economy, but Putin sees this in the vital interest of Russia to pursue it, and that's too bad for everybody. But over the long haul, it's really a bad choice for Russia.
I almost want to say, looking at what Putin's done, and then your talks of China threatening to take over or reclaim Taiwan, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And they're
That's
kind of
the way
pushing
they
the
see it.
boundaries. That's the way they see
that's
it,
the way-
reclaiming.
Yeah.
But then you've got Trump, who's gone into Venezuela, captured their president, their leader. He's now
Yeah.
talking about Greenland. Is this suddenly become a free for all? There is
I think it's
NATO.
I don't think it's a free for all. I think it's a different. It's a shift of geopolitical strategy. What's common to Iran and Venezuela? Oil. Who were they selling to? China at discounted rates. 75% of all the oil manufactured in Venezuela was going to China. The other 25% was a gift to Cuba. All right. They have capacity for 3 million barrels of oil production a day. They were only producing 775,000, all of which was going to China and Cuba. What does that do to prices? That increases prices because there's not enough. They're not putting that oil into the world marketplace, and they're funding under the table what the United States considers as part of a realigned axis of evil that includes communist states or authoritarian states like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. Resource control. Think of it this way. China bought one of the two mining companies in Greenland, and the Greenland has 39 of 50 most important strategic minerals that are useful for space and defense. That's one of the motivations for Trump acquiring Greenland, to prevent the Chinese from taking over the mineral rights there. Plus, there's oil and gas there that has not been developed. 98% of what Greenland exports happen to be shrimp. And so, it's interesting about Greenland because President Trump isn't the first president to try and get it. I might add, it started when Andrew Johnson bought Alaska. They were trying to buy Greenland from Denmark, and then after World War II, Harry Truman offered $100 million in gold to the Danes for Greenland, and in exchange, instead of them selling it, they gave them a treaty, 1951 treaty, which allowed us to put bases on Greenland. Which, if in my opinion, if the Trump administration were smarter about it, they would have used that treaty instead of confronting NATO and Denmark over acquiring Greenland, because they can do pretty much anything they want under that 1951 treaty in terms of building bases and cooperating with Denmark and the Greenlanders. But Trump had to make a big deal about it with NATO, and I think he overextended it a bit. You notice his style is to say, well, I think we're going to have to invade this country in order to get what we want. And then he goes to the negotiating table, right? Isn't that what he said about Panama? He says, well, I think we're going to have to invade Panama because guess what? Oh, yeah. What's the common theme? The Chinese were involved in taking over the management of the Panama Canal. All right. And so they fixed that without an invasion. But in terms of Maduro, of course, resource access, namely the oil, we didn't want that to go to China or to Cuba or anywhere else. Russia was also helping peddle the oil in a variety of places. And of course, the drug trade was the other lever that was used by designating foreign drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. That allows the U.S. military to get involved to counter it.
Is the reality of diplomacy and global politics compared to what people actually see in the media?
Well, they don't see much in the media about what diplomacy is. That has been pushed out of the curriculum because it's considered white man history and colonial history and that sort of thing. And so what is diplomacy? What does diplomacy involve? What does conflict resolution involve? Well, it involves all the things I mentioned earlier: economic, political, and military. What if you look at an embassy? What divisions do they have? Economic, political, and they have military attaché. It's not rocket science, but if you don't understand it, it might as well be.
Ron, when historians look back at the early 21st century, I mean, the wars after 9/11, the rise of China,
Right.
Russia's resurgence, do you think they'll see this period as a turning point in the global order?
I think yes. I think certainly 9/11 changed the world where we were at. It was a bipolar world where we had communism versus capitalism, or democracy versus socialism, if you will. But I think communism is probably the better term. And with the end of the Cold War, marked with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you saw a new problem, which was global non-state actor terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism, which started in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution of Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. One was Sunni, the other was Shia, in terms of the radical approach to terrorism. So my sense is that the end of the Cold War opened up a new set of problems that made themselves also vulnerable to state-sponsored and non-state actor terrorism. And so it was a new era that started after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. And now you're still seeing the results of that, dealing with religious terrorism. There have been 4 waves of terrorism. The first wave was the anarchist wave. The second wave was the anti-colonial wave. The third wave was we'll say the red wave, the communist wave of terrorism. And the fourth wave was religious terrorism, which started with the Islamic Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so we're still in the religious phase. And these phases go for about 40 years, as it turns out. There's a good political scientist at UCLA by the name of David Rappaport, who identified the 4 waves of modern terrorism, and very, very articulate. And I'd say that we're coming to the end, hopefully, of the 4th wave of modern terrorism. But then what's the next wave? We don't know.
What's the next one?
Yeah, we don't know.
You mentioned the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
Ultimately, do you think they made the world safer, or did they unintentionally create more instability?
Yes and yes. It can be both, right? It can be both, and that's the problem, because it's never one thing or the other. It's always a degree. Made the world safer because it wasn't going to be safe with Saddam Hussein and nuclear weapons, even though the weapons of mass destruction were discovered and disarmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think that war, many realize, was more than likely a mistake, and it was also recognized as such by George Tenet in his memoirs, who is the head of the CIA, who says he regrets ever saying the phrase, "It's a slam dunk that they have nuclear weapons." And George W. Bush's memoirs, where he regrets relying on the intelligence that caused so many deaths in Iraq. So there is some regret from the leadership that decided to go into Iraq. Now let's talk about Afghanistan. I knew people in the Al Gore campaign, and I certainly knew people in the George W. Bush administration and pretty high up. And I asked the foreign policy director for Al Gore if he would have gone into Iraq, and he said, no, we would have had to go into Afghanistan because of the 9/11 attacks, but we would not have gone into Iraq without support from allies in the United Nations. And that was a difference. So I think if start doing a, a vector analysis of this, that most think that the war in Iraq was a mistake, even though it may have stopped him from building nuclear weapons at an advanced pace. Afghanistan, there was no choice in the matter because you had to go after the training camps of Al Qaeda that were based in Afghanistan.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda.
Or else you were inviting another 9/11. What did we accomplish in Afghanistan when you think of it? We left, and who's in power? The same people that we tried to get out of power after 9/11. The Taliban are back in power. So,
Exactly.
but for a brief moment in time, this would be a good name of a book, and I think it is a name of a book, we were able to build infrastructure in Afghanistan. We were able to allow young women to go to school. We were allowed to give the Afghans a choice of their political future other than to grow heroin poppies in their fields, to probably look at other things like lithium, which they could have used as their lithium is in every cell phone and every technological gadget we have. And it's the new gold, if you will. And they have some of the largest deposits in the world. But what happened instead? Taliban are back in power, and they're leasing the lithium mines to the Chinese. So there you have it.
You mentioned policymakers, and were there warning signs at the time that policymakers may have ignored?
Regarding 9/11? Yes, there were, and the best report on that is the congressional report, the 9/11 report, written by Chris Kojum, who was a Robert Bosch Fellow with me in Germany at a certain point, but he was a congressional staffer, and they went through step by step what signs were missed, and there was plenty of intelligence to suggest that Al Qaeda wanted to attack the United States. That intelligence was not shared between the FBI and the CIA. FBI can only do business within the United States, and the CIA can only do business outside the United States. They didn't share it, and one of the things that happened as a result of that is they created a new director of national intelligence. So that he could integrate the 17 different intelligence agencies and the information so that it could get to the president in a summarized form, but in an aggregated form, so that nothing would be missed. But that was something that came out of the 9/11 report, that there was not sharing of intelligence, which could have led to the stopping of the 9/11 attacks.
For decades, the West largely defined the global order economically, politically, and even in military. Are
Yeah.
we now witnessing the beginning of a shift where that dominance is slowly eroding?
Well, when you say influence and dominate, influence, I think, is still prevalent. Dominate, I think you're right. It's diminished because as other countries grow their economies, whether it be India, China, or the like, you'll see that others want to have the same things that the West has, including control over their national interests, which are economic, political, and military in nature. It is the rise and fall of various civilizations all turns on who's rising and who's falling, and for what reason. I think Africa still has yet to rise. Sub-Saharan Africa still has yet to rise because it was carved up by the colonialists in such a way that reminds me of Rome, namely divide and conquer, right? And divide, split up for colonial mercantile reasons, and conquer. I think of Cecil Rhodes and the debate at Oxford I still teach at Oxford over taking down his statue because, he went down and exploited Rhodesia, named after him, for diamonds and what have you. And let's not forget the French. Let's not forget the Portuguese. And the British as well. So the carving up of Africa into 54 different states has prevented it from developing into a superpower of its own.
So there was a strategic move. Yeah.
That was a strategic move by Britain and France and Portugal and Spain to take over territory to exploit minerals and shovel them towards their respective states, which in turn helped develop the Western world, but at a cost to at a real cost to Africa.
Ron, let's stay in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly South Africa.
Yeah,
South Africa recently hosted the G20 summit, and the United States chose not to participate. Now the next G20 summit will be hosted by the US, and South Africa hasn't been invited.
Right.
As South Africans, I mean, we're a little confused, right? Because we watch American movies, we listen to your music,
right,
and we feel we're part of the cultural family, right? So what's going on here geopolitically?
Well, I think that there has been some moves by South Africa to provide minerals to Russia, and that has caused a problem with the United States, and that there has been a rapprochement with Russia and China in South Africa by the government that in turn makes us wonder where that cultural affinity has gone, and what's the rationale for working with enemies of the United States, whereas we should be working together as allies. I think that's part of it, and it may not be stated, but that's what I'm hearing.
Do you think South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ also plays a part in this?
Well, it fits a certain pattern. It fits a certain pattern that goes against the interests of the United States, which is an ally of Israel. The United States is not part of the ICJ, and nor I don't think Israel is either. But the fact of the matter is that they see it as more a political organization that people play with rather than look at the real facts and issues on the ground of who they wish to support for what reasons. And many people in the United States look at those organizations, well, what are they trying to do? And why are they against the United States and our allies? That's also the case with the UN, and where there are many who criticize the United States, and the United States pays for a lot of its budget. At a certain point, Americans go, what's in it for us, American taxpayers? And even though the United Nations was an American idea, if you're looking at America first, why is it we spend a lot of money on Europe that should be defending itself? Or why is it we're spending a lot of money on the UN that all it does is criticize us and write resolutions that are never enforced? That's the kind of arguments you start to hear. But
coming back to South Africa, I mean, today we sit at a very interesting crossroad geopolitically. And I think you've brought that up. I mean, historical ties and cultural connections with the West, and particularly with the US and Europe. And then on the other hand, with BRICS. And these are the countries that we often align with that challenge Western influence. From a geopolitical perspective, how do major powers actually view South Africa today? I mean, do you guys see us as a partner, perhaps a strategic swing state or vote, or something else completely, entirely?
No, I think that's correct. I think most Americans that are in foreign policy understand that South Africa is a partner. They're concerned about the political redirection of your government towards China and Russia in particular, and that there is a question whether or not the government of South Africa can be trusted. But at the same time, recognizing that we have those cultural affinities and ties, we're not writing you off because you're too important. You're too important.
That's good to know.
Yeah, and I think, but let's just say the jury's still out on where things are going in terms of your relationship with potential adversaries of the United States, and so that's the big concern. And I have lots of friends who are South Africans that have left South Africa. In fact, several of my doctors are South African. It so turns out, and they tell me, so what's going on in South Africa really concerns them. The crime is up, that the government's unstable, and they're making deals with people that would have never happened, say, 20, 30 years ago. And they are now American citizens informing the American government of what's happening in South Africa. So South Africa needs to have a bit more of a lobbying presence, if I should put it that way, in the halls of Congress. But you should also be aware that by extending a friendly handshake to America's enemies, that gets noticed.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Do you think South Africa represents the emerging voice of what many will call the global South? Nations that don't want to be defined solely by West or Eastern power structures. I mean, we just the South. We South Africa. We
Yeah,
have our own identity.
I think that's fine for those who want to think in that way, but those that are engaged in outside of the global South will see that as a sideshow. Well, that's very nice. That's very nice that you see yourselves that way. And it's very nice that, and what is that? And 50 cents buys you a cup of coffee. Not anymore, it's $5. But so the issue is, how does that become important to those who are not engaged in it, right? So is it a diplomatic way of saying, well, we can organize ourselves sort of like the non-aligned bloc during the Cold War days? You had Yugoslavia that was non-aligned, played both sides, and got something from both sides. One could argue that the global South is doing the same thing.
Ron, I want to take you back to the wars again, if that's
Sure.
okay. And
Sure.
in conflicts where civilians are caught in the middle, how do
Mhm.
policymakers balance the military objectives with humanitarian consequences? How do we balance that?
I find that in Western militaries, it's much different than in authoritarian militaries, or in the case of especially Iran, um, where the ends justify the means has been is basically employed for 47 years. And shall we say that terrorist organizations use the same approach in asymmetric warfare? They don't pay attention to the laws of war because it doesn't benefit them. So they're going to do whatever they can to do the most outrageous things in contravenance of the laws of war in order to bring their political y- their political grudge to light. And so when it comes to Western militaries, the United States and Israel, they drop leaflets before they're going to do anything. They try and negotiate before they're going to try and do anything, and at least give the other side a chance to come clean before. And there is the development of precision weaponry ha- also comes as a way to lessen civilian casualties, so that you can go specifically after specific targets, and avoid killing civilians. In authoritarian countries, they don't give a damn about killing civilians. They just want their objective. And in fact, if it helps them get there without any political problem, well, just use it, and then we'll deflect away from it by just lying to the press and putting out false social media to suggest that, oh, everything is wonderful, and you guys are the real oppressors. And in fact, when somebody's pointing at you, remember, 2 or 3 fingers are pointing back at you, right? I remember my dad taught me that. Boy, does that come in handy sometimes in international relations. To deflect attention away from yourself, you accuse the other side of doing the same thing. So I think there is a moral backbone to protecting civilians, has always been that way. I mean, and that has been a Western development, Western Europe. What has made it much more difficult is the advent of weapons of mass destruction, because if one of those gets used, there's no distinction between military and the community, because it will destroy both.
After studying global politics for decades now,
Mm.
do you think humanity has learned anything about how to resolve these deeply rooted conflicts like this? Or do we just keep repeating the same patterns?
Well, I think yes and yes. It's not an either or. I think that we have learned some things. I think there's been resolution of some conflicts that have taken into account what happens if you don't have a peaceful resolution. And I know some diplomats that have successfully done some things. Say Northern Ireland is one case. Senator Mitchell got involved in it and helped settle the troubles. I think the when Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. That was a very important first step. That was followed by Jordan in 1994. That was followed by the Abraham Accords of the first Trump, and I assume second Trump administration will get back to them at some point. And it's interesting to see that the Crown Prince Pahlavi, who's looking for a job in the next Iranian government, it certainly will play some sort of role, but he's piggybacking on the Abraham Accords, saying that he wants something called the Cyrus Accords, after Cyrus the Great of 2,500 years ago, who had a very successful and prosperous Iran with tolerance of all religions. So there are some things to be learned from the past that people apply. And if they hadn't been applied, we'd still be at war. Other things that people don't learn, that when you start a war that you think it's going to be quick, it usually ends up being much longer and much costlier than what you estimated, because it doesn't because the other side has something to say in this too, besides you. And so having to think through that, I think we have learned some things, but we do fall back into a pattern that if we don't get our way, eventually we turn to violence, and that may just be a human trait that has always been with us and will always be there. But it would be nice to learn more about the conflict resolution side. That is not taught in schools, I might add, and it certainly is not prevalent in our political discourse. Very uncivil these days, especially in the United States. It's very polarized. I don't know about South Africa, but you have many political parties there. The use of civility in government is almost an anachronism, if not an oxymoron, because no one compromises. Everyone has to have their way, or it's the highway.
Yeah, Ron, in most wars, there's always an end game. There's a treaty, there's a political settlement, a new balance of
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
In all the wars that are currently taking place, I mean, what does an actual end game even look like?
Well, I think in the case of Iran, the end game that Israel and the United States want is like the end game of World War II, where there'd be unconditional surrender and there's a change of government that is no longer going to be associated with ayatollahs and Islamic fundamentalism. As in World War II, we had to get rid of fascism as well as Nazism. I think that's what's wanted there. In terms of the Ukraine situation, it's unfortunate because Russia sees Ukraine as a vital interest, and it sees the land that it has acquired 20% of Ukraine as Russian. Whereas all the blood that's been shed on the Ukrainian side, they don't want to sit down at a peace table and say, yeah, that's yours, because we're worried that you're going to come take the rest of it. I think there needs to be compromise in that Russia needs to be able to pull back some in the Donbass region and give the Ukrainians something. But the Ukrainians also have to give the Russians something, to give them a pledge that they will not join NATO in over a period of time, because that's what the Russians don't want. They want a neutral Ukraine that doesn't have an official affiliation with the EU, because they know once you have an affiliation with the EU, the next thing to come is NATO. They share a 1,200-mile border with Ukraine, the Russians do, and that they don't want NATO troops on the other side, and they don't want Nutella on the other side. They want access to the Russian-speaking areas from Crimea up through the Donbass, and there is going to have to be a compromise somewhere. Land for peace as far as the Ukrainians go, and for the Russians, they have to have a neutral Ukraine for at least a period of time, or else they'll keep fighting. I think they could base it on, well, it's too late now, but earlier, if they had looked at the Austrian Treaty of 1955, peace treaty, where Austria is neutral, but they had the Soviets there until 1955, until they negotiated that they would be neutral. And once they did that, both the Soviets and the Americans left, and then they associated themselves more with the EU and more with NATO, but the Soviets were out. And so that would be a nice model for Ukraine. But now that they've been dug in, killing each other for 4 years, I think that opportunity has passed.
And the end game for Israel and Palestine? What do you think that's...
The end game is what I think they're trying to do is to, it's not going to be easy. First, it's connected to the war with Iran, namely that Iran controlled its proxies, one of whom was Hamas. And by taking Iran out, that should cut off the financial and ideological support for Hamas, which they want to get rid of altogether. If Hamas is allowed to continue governing Gaza in any way, shape, or form, there will never be peace in the Middle East. And I think that's the way to go. Or else Israel is always going to be looking over its shoulder at Hamas and October 7th as the second worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And that's how they're describing it. So I think the board of peace is a nice idea, but the board of execution, in terms of making sure that nobody's killing each other and that you rebuild Gaza to a point where there can be some economic activity, that's allowed to happen. Hamas never allowed the Palestinian farmers to sell their goods to Europe or anywhere, because that meant that they would become independent from Hamas. And I saw that when I was there in 2005, 2006, for $3 million worth of strawberries that and I saw the fields of them, that they were bringing to market at the gates of Carney, and the gates of Carney were attacked by Hamas. And so what does Israel do? Shuts down the gates because there was a terrorist attack. And so the strawberries went rotten in the fields. They were not able to export it to Europe for money. And that was all designed by Hamas to control, to create opportunity for the Palestinian. It's a shame. I have many Israeli and many Palestinian friends, because I worked in the Middle East for 6 years with 22 militaries, as I mentioned. We were involved in the successful transfer of Israelis from Gaza out of Gaza in 2005. And then when Hamas got elected in 2006, we were going to use that before Hamas got elected, we were going to use that as a model to take to the West Bank. That never happened because Hamas got elected in Gaza and started shooting rockets at Israel. So the Israelis saw that they had, rather than land for peace, they exchanged land for missiles, Qassam rockets, that were landing on Sderot. And I went to visit the mayor of Sderot, who was educated in the United States at Brandeis, and he had established a Red Dawn system, he called it. They knew that when the rockets were coming from Gaza, they had 15 seconds. And so the alarm would go off, red dawn. Everybody knew to get behind a car or get into a bomb shelter if there was one nearby, because the Palestinians had shot rockets in their general direction. Imagine living like that? And I said, how do you live like that? As I'm sitting in his office at his desk, where he has a Qassam rocket that didn't go off, that fell in his backyard, with pictures of 35 children who'd been killed by them. This was in 2005. This is 21 years ago. All right. He said, well, you deal with the Arabs. Are they going to stop shooting rockets at it anytime soon? And I says, yeah, I deal with the Arabs, but not the terrorists. And we have to separate the two, because they're not one and the same. And that is the problem that they're going to have to tackle in with the Board of Peace in Gaza after the end of hostilities there, because they're not going to want to allow Hamas to have anything to do with it, and they're going to want to have something to do with it.
Ron, let's talk about something that you know a lot about, but people rarely think about, and it still shapes global security, right? I mean, we live in a world with thousands of nuclear weapons. Are we becoming dangerously complacent about the risks associated with that?
I think we are, because we thought the end of the Cold War meant at the end of nuclear weapons. It in fact reduced the number of nuclear weapons by 75% because we negotiated with the Soviets to do that. I mean, at one point we had 200,000 nuclear weapons. When now we're down to about 1,500 each to maybe 2,000 each, but that's still enough to blow up the world several times over. And those nuclear accords, in fact, the one that they're debating right now called the New START Treaty, is only between the United States and Russia as the inheritor of the Soviet nuclear weapons. So the United States has suggested, and I have suggested actually, and during Democratic and Republican administrations, you can't have nuclear weapons accords now without getting the Chinese involved, because the Chinese have modernized to a point where they're getting to over 1,000 nuclear weapons, if not more. So you can't have an arms control treaty that deals with weapons of mass destruction unless you have all parties that are involved in it. So I think, do we want national serenity or national security? And national serenity is what we all seek, but we can't have it unless we understand that behind it, you must have national security, which means you have to know that nuclear weapons are a threat, and you have to make sure that they're controlled and never used other than for deterrence purposes. And that is hard for many to swallow, but I think even Winston Churchill said it best during World War II, when he was discussing this with Franklin Roosevelt. He says, well, there'll be a day where we have to rely on these things, these terrible things, in order to stop terrible things. We got very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I interviewed most of the remaining members of John F. Kennedy's cabinet for a nuclear history project and a book I wrote called Looking the Tiger in the Eye, Confronting the Nuclear Threat. And I think we still need to look the tiger in the eye, but we've become more complacent about it, as you suggest. And if there's one thing you should never become complacent about, is something that has the potential of blowing up a city, but not just from the blast, from radiation, from heat that's hotter than the sun, from electromagnetic pulse that would fry every cell phone and every communication equipment. And so you wouldn't be able to communicate. You wouldn't know where anybody was. And let's put it this way. The wars that are taking place currently look like kindergarten compared to if one or two nuclear bombs went off anywhere. But the thing is, everyone was hopeful that the nuclear age would bring the end to war, but it sure didn't, did it? They just operated underneath the shadow of their omnipresence.
Whether it's a nuclear deterrence, a stabilizing force, or a fragile system humanity is gambling with,
Well, it's both. It's both. In fact, it's using one to do the other, and that's it's both, isn't it? When you think of it, that's why creating doubt in the user's mind that if I use this, I'm going to get the same thing back. And do I want that? Is what system, either communist, democratic, socialist, or God knows what else, could survive after their society is attacked by a nuclear weapon, or many?
Ron, how close has the world actually come to a nuclear catastrophe in the past few decades? Have we been close?
24 hours. 24 hours. That's what Secretary McNamara told me about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that he thought he was going home Saturday night, and he didn't think he'd see another Saturday night because they were about to invade Cuba the next day. And if it hadn't been for Robert Kennedy doing some side diplomacy with the Soviets on here's a potential deal we could do, it would have happened because they had meetings with the Soviets afterwards in Cuba 40 years later with those who were in charge of the nuclear weapons that were deployed on Cuba. And they said that they had orders if the United States invaded to let them all go. Right. Yeah, right. No, so that was the closest we ever came. We came pretty close in Berlin as well during the Berlin crisis. I remember interviewing McGeorge Bundy about that one, and he was there, and I read his memo. He gave me a copy of his memo that was recently declassified when he gave it to him, and he said, "Mr. President, before you decide what to do in Berlin, you may want to look at the PSYOP, which is the targeting doctrine for nuclear weapons, and that you'll have very little choice other than to release all of our nuclear weapons to destroy the entirety of the Soviet Union, which would have some risks for us. But so before you make your decision, before you reach your decision of thermonuclear truth, why don't you look at the PSYOP?"
Mm.
So this brinkmanship was going on during the Cold War, mostly at top secret levels, and so the public didn't realize it. But the closest was certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were within 24 hours of a nuclear war.
How many nuclear nations are there now? And if we have to go into nuclear war right now, how long before the world ends as we know it?
Well, it would end the first time it's used as we know it, because no one that's alive right now ever saw or participated in the cleanup of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So, and those were 13 kiloton weapons, the equivalent of 13 tons of TNT. We now have 10 to 15 million tons of TNT equivalent with thermonuclear weapons. That's why they're a deterrent. In other words, you don't want to risk anything that's going to lead to that, and that also, makes it very, very important that we take these things seriously and we negotiate their control so that they don't fall into the wrong hands. That was a big worry after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Would there be loose nukes that could be sold to bad actors and even non-state actors? In fact, there was a scare right after 9/11 where a report came to the White House that 1 month after 9/11 that a Russian nuclear weapon had been smuggled out through Canada and into New York City, and there were Chechen terrorists prepared to explode it. They didn't wait to hear from experts on why that was very unlikely to happen. But nuclear weapons have many safeguards on them, so no one else can use them. That's the first thing, but that's about as much as I can say. And the second thing is have to be maintained every certain period of time, and if they're not maintained after a certain period of time, they shut down. So that's another mechanism built into them so that bad actors won't take them and be able to use them. See, you'd be surprised at all the various mechanisms that have been thought of to protect this from unauthorized use, and pretty robust, I might say. But when you get concerned is when a country like Iran, who doesn't have these controls on it and says it wants to erase Israel off the map, starts developing centrifuges 100 to 200 feet underground underneath reinforced concrete, that you recognize that they are not building civilian nuclear power. Why would they need civilian nuclear power? Because they have enough oil and gas to last 900 years to fuel their economy. So it's not about diversifying their energy grid. It's about strategic advantage over somebody they hate, and that would be Israel and the United States. Death to America, death to Israel. Well, that's being turned around at the moment.
Ron, another part of geopolitics most people rarely see is intelligence.
Yes.
How much of global politics is actually shaped by intelligence operations rather than conventional warfare?
Well, it's certainly an extremely important part of it, because if you have bad intelligence or intelligence that doesn't get to the right people in time, you get a 9/11. If you have good intelligence, you know where the Ayatollah and 48 other people are meeting at the same time so that you can eliminate the threat. And so that's what just happened in Iran. Bad intelligence led to a war in Iraq, whereas we assumed that there was weapons of mass destruction already there. He was trying to build them, but he had built some things that were very close to nuclear weapons that had been disarmed by the IAEA, but that caused the war and all the deaths that resulted. At the same time, good intelligence can keep you out of a war. So these are just a few examples, but most military operations before they get going require intelligence. But now it's not just people on the ground; it's signals intelligence, listening in on communications and satellite intelligence. Satellites can take pictures of your license plate and read the numbers off of them from outer space. So they're pretty accurate. And also satellites can also determine whether or not there's radioactive material in a certain place. And so there's all sorts of ways that you can learn about what's going on, but probably the most important is human intelligence, namely having people on the ground that can analyze what's happening in a political situation and analyze it correctly so that you can decide whether you act or not act, depending on what's going on. So intelligence is very important, has always been, and continues to be very important. And who's the best at it in the world? The Israelis. The Israelis are the best at it, and they certainly. Although during this last operation, the reports came out that it was a combined effort, CIA and the Mossad, that figured out where the Ayatollah was going to be because they'd been tracking him for 3 months. And they knew his whereabouts, and they knew side who told them about the meeting. So,
You mentioned two types of intelligence.
Yeah, well, the human intelligence, and then there's technical, signals intelligence,
technical.
and then there's yeah, and for any, it's always a what they call a crapshoot. It's a snapshot in time of what's going on, and you have to have, the general rule of thumb in the books, at least, is that you have to have 3 independent sources that have come to the same conclusion for something to be possible and actionable.
Ron, have you heard of Pegasus? So apparently it was software developed by the Israelis, which was bought by MBS, the prince or leader of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Who then used it to pretty much spy on or listen on Jeff Bezos, who at the time Amazon had purchased the Washington Post.
Right.
And if you remember, one of their journalists apparently was slaughtered, if that's the right word, in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, I do remember that. It's alleged that this is how this all happened. But it wouldn't surprise me, simply because there was something at one point in the history of the Iranian nuclear program where someone from the Israeli Mossad put a thumb drive into the computers that dealt with the centrifuges and basically destroyed the centrifuges over a period of time without them knowing it. And that set them back a couple of years in terms of developing fissile grade or weapons grade materials. You may remember, it wasn't that long ago, but Hezbollah in Lebanon all used a certain pager that was delivered to them that happened to be loaded with explosives by Israeli intelligence, and everyone sent them a phone call all at the same time, and they were all killed, or many of them were killed. There was another instance where there was a remote controlled piece of equipment on a highway in Iran that they had over time noticed that one of the main nuclear scientists took this highway to work every day in a certain car every day at a certain time every day. So they set up a piece of equipment with a missile in it. Remotely, when that car came by, they pressed the button and it destroyed that car and the nuclear scientist inside of it. So it's There's a lot of cloak and dagger that goes on in this business, but information is key. And if you have the right information, it can be crucial to any military operation.
So there's not much privacy, I would assume, nowadays. I mean, with all the software going on.
Don't put, we're being listened to. Every time I mention the word Russia, sometimes my podcasts shut down. I'm not kidding. So it's very funny. So they're reminding me we're still watching you. And anything you put on the internet, anything you put on your phone, anything you do electronically can be seen by somebody. Every phone call you've ever made could be listened to by somebody. It doesn't matter to whom. So be careful. I tell my students, don't put anything online that you wouldn't want your grandmother to read. So you just accept it as part of life. But these days, especially these days, whatever you're using through the internet or through international communications, you just have to assume that somebody's listening in. That doesn't mean they care. They're listening for keywords and things like that will trigger a more interest.
Well, I'm about to turn up the heat, so get ready, because I was listening to a podcast recently.
Yeah, all right.
And you were speaking of the two types of intelligence, right? One was the technological, and two was the human aspect of the intelligence. And on one of the podcasts with Stephen Bartlett, one of his guests was Gavin De Becker, which was the world-renowned security expert, who mentioned that Jeffrey Epstein was an intelligence asset. Is that true?
He knew a lot of people. He was a very rich man with debatable morals, to say the least. And he invited lots of people to his festivities, as I'll call them. And he would be an intelligence asset for somebody if so motivated. But he wouldn't be motivated by money because he had plenty of that. The issue is what would have motivated. Many are motivated by ideology or money. Those are the two biggies. But I don't know what his ideology was other than Philistinism, or who knows. Who knows what it was? But he might have done something like that just because he thought it would be fun. I've heard that as a possibility that he might be, but for whom is a good question.
From a national security perspective, I mean, when someone has access to that many powerful people, does that raise questions about whether intelligence agencies might have taken an interest in him?
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's what they want. They want people with access to decision makers or people with influence. And what sort of what conversations? I mean, they could have bugged his place, or he might have allowed them to bug his place. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, but he would be of interest to foreign agencies because of the quality of leadership that came through his doors.
For sure. Ron, do you know much about compromat? Is that how you say it? Kompromat, compromat. So apparently it's a concept of gathering compromising information on powerful individuals to influence them later.
Russian technique. It's a KGB technique to get something so you can blackmail them cooperating with you, to compromise something private or something that creates something that puts them in a compromising position, take pictures of it, and then hold it against the individual so that they will cooperate with you. It's an old KGB thing I remember being briefed on at some point.
And I guess I'm alluding to the Epstein files, how much of it was kind of, how much of that was used in terms of blackmailing elite individuals?
Well, that would be interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but it could be. Could be, certainly, because he was doing shady things. Shady things are what lead to compromise.
And it's strange, isn't it? How could someone like Epstein operate, for decades around powerful figures without being stopped? It's strange that it would carry on for such a long period. Well, I guess it tells a lot about relationship with wealth.
It's also his ignominious end in a cell, hanging himself. Some people don't believe he hung himself.
Do you think this story of Epstein network will ever be publicly understood or exposed?
I don't think so, simply because there are too many people that are high up that were involved in it that will not want to see it come to light. That's my bet. And that's just a gut feeling.
Ron, one of your other expertise is climate. And most people think
Yeah.
of climate change as an environmental
Hmm.
issue, but
Right.
experts are also calling it a security issue. Is climate
Yes.
change becoming a geopolitical driver of conflict?
Well, it is in reality if you're fighting over resources, if you're fighting over water, if you're well, let's take a look at the conflict in Iran. What's one of the realities of Iran over the last 5 years has been a 5-year drought. 5-year drought, which has meant that they haven't been able to grow food and they have to buy their food from overseas. It's 99% less than it was before the Islamic Republic came into being. And if that's the case, then your population gets upset that they have no water and they have no food, and inflation is at 52%, and it takes to the streets. So that fuels a problem for Iran. You can look at that as either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you sit, but it's caused by climate, the drought. The drought has made it more difficult. You have seen in India and China with the soot that's been in the air that it has affected agricultural outcomes in terms of too much soot in the air has diminished the ability to grow. Remember the Green Revolution in India, that fertilizers enabled the growing of more food and more efficiently and with more volume. Well, the soot in the air from burning brown coal, from burning the lignite that 40% of it goes up into the atmosphere, affects agriculture in that area. Um, that can lead to conflict. And there's certainly been a couple of conflicts avoided between India and Pakistan, and some of it's over resources as well. I think it's an part of conflict that the climate is become, well, let's just say climate change is exactly that. It doesn't mean that the world's coming to an end, but it means that certain places are becoming hotter, certain places are becoming wetter, certain places are melting, and that water has to go somewhere, and that goes into the oceans. Then you have more storms. You have more storms. You have more severe storms. So, in all of that can affect the well-being of any country, but a country that is on the verge of conflict or in conflict, this can exacerbate the conditions on the ground for especially the innocents that have to survive the nonsense of the politicians and the military guys. So I think it's starting to get looked at as important, but the fact of the matter is, it's seen in the United States. It's very divisive now. You're either for climate change or against climate change. I took scientists to several COP meetings, Conference of the Party meetings, which are the annual meetings. This shows you how long I've been involved. I was at COP 4, 5, and 6. We're now at like 30, 31, 32, somewhere up there. And I was the moderator for these guys to talk about their research, and we talked about the brown cloud over Asia and how it was affecting crops, and we talked about the possibility of interrupting natural things that happen in terms of currents in the Atlantic Ocean, that were to shut down, that there would be another ice age in Europe and whatnot. The question is, where are you for or against climate change? Rather than understanding what it is and then applying it to your particular situation. And it became very clear to the scientists that they were wasting their time, because folks there were either interested in promoting a certain type of energy over another because they had an economic interest in doing so, or that they weren't being realistic about what the true nature of the science was, and that you needed to take it into account. And so you'll note that certain administrations, American administrations, are more interested in it than others. And certainly under the current administration, they're not interested in exploring it very much because they want to drill more for oil and use the resources that are under the earth for developing more fossil fuels, regardless of the consequences, because they don't think there are any. And I don't think that's wise, because I do think there are some, and I tend to be on the conservative side, but I've worked for both Democratic and Republican administrations, and I like to make fact-based analysis, not politically based analysis.
Ron, after everything you've seen, studied about war and diplomacy, and
Mhm.
do you think people understand how fragile peace really is?
It is very fragile. You're right. They don't. and they don't. And, it's, we've sort of outsourced our concerns about foreign policy to our leaders because we want to live our own lives. And that's the way it should be. But if our leaders aren't paying close enough attention to what happens, there are many places in the world where that's not the case, and that people are trying to take advantage of others by political control and trying to spread their control, whether it be drug cartels, whether it be international terrorism, whether it be authoritarian states. And they you notice they ebb and flow, they come and go, but they're always there. And so I think if we're going to be balanced about it, we have to realize that we should count our blessings for everything that we have compared to what most people have in most parts of the world. Number one, and number two, we should not take for granted that everybody in the world isn't like us, and that we shouldn't worry about those that want to take advantage of and diminish what we have so that they can have more.
True. Ronald Bee, thank you for sharing your insights and helping us understand a world that often feels incredibly complex. Thank you for your
Well,
time.
it is. And we should remember it is incredibly complex, but you shouldn't be overwhelmed by it. You can learn about it. One of those good places is Congressional Research Service has something on every topic that you could ever think of. It's all online, and it has to be balanced because I know I had to sign an oath when I worked there that you had to provide all points of view. You couldn't take one side, and whatever the issue, and it was reviewed by 13 different people to make sure that it was balanced before they published it. So anything that the Congressional Research Service puts out, you just type it in Google, and then the topic, there is a report on it. And there will be one on Iran, there will be one on nuclear weapons, there'll be on everything we talked about today.
Wow, Ronald, that's impressive. I will certainly have a look. And if the listeners want to check that out as well, I think that could provide some insight.
It's a quick study. It's a quick study because it's made for members of Congress and their staffs. But since it's publicly paid for, the public has a right to see it.
Ronald, thank you again. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
It's been
Thank you for having
awesome.
me.
Absolutely. Anytime. We should do this again, please.
I'd be happy to if you want to stick on one topic or many. I like what you're trying to do, and I think it's very important.
Thank you very much, Ronald.